Two brothers, same father, different mothers. One divine promise that would split into TWO nations, TWO faiths, and a family conflict that has echoed through 4,000 years of human history. This isn't a story about modern politics. This is the ancient origin story, the biblical account, of how one family's dysfunction became the foundation narrative for billions of people across three major world religions. Abraham had TWO sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and the choices made in that ancient tent in the desert of Canaan set in motion consequences that are still unfolding today. But here's what will blow your mind. The biblical story is not what most people think. It's not about hatred between brothers. It's not about religious warfare. It's about a family flawed human making desperate decisions under impossible pressure. It's about God's promises, human impatience, and how both sons received blessings, not just one. This is the real story of Isaac and Ishmael, not the politicized version, not the simplified Sunday school version. The full biblical narrative that reveals something profound about promises, patience, family, and how God works through both lines. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand the ancient roots of one of history's most significant family stories and why it matters for understanding the world today, the promise, where it all began. To understand Isaac and Ishmael, you have to start with their father, Abraham. The original promise, around 2000 BC, God called a man named Abram, later renamed Abraham, from the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. God made him an extraordinary promise, what theologians call the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 12:2-3 records God's words, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Notice what God promised. 1. A great nation, descendants. 2. A great name, legacy. 3. Blessing to all peoples, universal impact. 4. Land, mentioned in verse 7. "To your offspring I will give this land." This was huge. God was saying, "Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of nations. Through your descendants, the entire world will be blessed." The problem, Abraham, then called Abram, was 75 years old when God made this promise. His wife Sarah, then called Sarai, was 65, and they had nitrogen monoxide children. Think about that. God promises you'll be the father of nations, ... but you're elderly and childless. Abraham believed God. Genesis 15:6 says, "Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness." This faith became foundational to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three religions traced their spiritual lineage to Abraham's faith. But believing didn't immediately solve the problem. Years passed. Abraham was 85, still no child. Sarah was now 75 and past childbearing age by any natural measure. Here's what you need to understand about ancient Near Eastern culture. Having an heir was everything. Your name, your property, your legacy, all of it depended on having a son. In that culture, if a wife couldn't conceive, it was considered acceptable, even expected, for her to provide her husband with a female servant who could bear children on her behalf. The child would legally belong to the wife, continuing the family line. This wasn't scandalous. This was the cultural norm for dealing with infertility. Sarah knew this. She had a servant, an Egyptian woman named Hagar, and Sarah came up with a plan. The impatience. Hagar and Ishmael. Genesis 16 records one of the most human moments in Scripture, a moment of desperation, cultural practice, and ultimately, family dysfunction that would have lasting consequences. Sarah's proposal. Sarah said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Notice how Sarah framed this. The Lord has kept me from having children. She saw her infertility as divine obstruction. So she decided to help God fulfill his promise through culturally acceptable means. Abraham agreed. Genesis 16:2 says simply, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Was this wrong? From a biblical perspective, it showed impatience trying to fulfill God's promise through human effort rather than waiting for God's timing. But it wasn't considered immoral by the cultural standards of that time. It was practical problem solving. Abraham was 86 years old. He'd been waiting for God's promise for 11 years. And now his wife was giving him permission, even urging him to have a child with her servant. Hagar's perspective. We need to pause and consider Hagar's perspective in all this. She was Egyptian, likely acquired during Abraham and Sarah's earlier trip to Egypt, Genesis 12. She was a slave. She had no choice in this arrangement. When Abraham slept with her, she became pregnant. And something shifted in the household dynamics. Genesis 16:4 says, he slept with Hagar and she became pregnant. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. The Hebrew word suggests Hagar began to look down on Sarah. She was bearing the child Sarah couldn't. She had what Sarah wanted most. And in that ancient culture, bearing a son for the patriarch elevated your status significantly. The family breakdown. Sarah's response was bitter. You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Wait, Sarah proposed this arrangement. Abraham agreed to it. Hagar got pregnant as intended. And now Sarah is angry at Abraham for doing what she asked? This is painfully human. Sarah's plan backfired emotionally. She thought she could handle it, but jealousy, resentment, and hurt overwhelmed her. Abraham's response? Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. He completely abdicated responsibility, threw Hagar under the bus, refused to manage the conflict he'd helped create. Hagar's flight. Sarah began to mistreat Hagar so badly that Hagar fled into the desert. A pregnant woman, alone, running away into the wilderness. This could have been the end of her story, death in the desert, forgotten by history. But then something remarkable happened. God sees Hagar. Genesis 16:7-13 records one of the most tender moments in Scripture. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? God saw her. God spoke to her. God cared about her, an Egyptian slave woman, caught in someone else's family drama, pregnant and alone. The angel told her, return to Sarah and submit, for her own safety and the child's future. 2. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. 3. You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. 4. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Let's unpack this. First, God promised Hagar her OWN line of countless descendants. This wasn't just about being Abraham's son's mother. Ishmael would father nations. Second, the name Ishmael means God hears. It was a permanent reminder that God heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness. Third, the description, wild donkey of a man, isn't an insult. In that culture, the wild donkey represented freedom and independence. It was a Bedouin ideal, free, untamed, beholden to no one. Fourth, his hand against everyone describes the independent, nomadic lifestyle of his descendants, not hatred, but self-sufficiency and fierce independence. Hagar returned and gave birth to Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Abraham loved Ishmael. Here's what's crucial. Abraham loved Ishmael. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son. Abraham raised him, taught him, invested in him. Every hope Abraham had for God's promise was focused on this boy. When God later appeared to Abraham and told him Sarah would bear a son, Abraham's immediate response, Genesis 17:18, was, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Abraham wasn't rejecting Ishmael. He was advocating for him. He wanted God's promise to be fulfilled through Ishmael, the son he'd raised and loved for 13 years. The miracle, Isaac's birth, the impossible promise fulfilled. When Abraham was 99 years old and Sarah was 90, God appeared again and made a shocking announcement. Sarah herself would bear a son. Sarah, listening from the tent, laughed. Genesis 18:12 records her thought. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" It was the laugh of impossibility. The laugh of a woman who'd given up hope decades ago. The laugh of someone who thought God's promise would be fulfilled through Ishmael, not through her own body. God responded, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." And exactly as God promised, Sarah conceived. At 90 years old, against all biological possibility. Genesis 21:1-3. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. The name Isaac means he laughs, a permanent reminder of Sarah's laugh of disbelief that turned into joyful laughter. 2 sons, 2 promises. Now Abraham had two sons. Ishmael, 13 years old, son of Hagar, the Egyptian Isaac, a newborn, son of Sarah, the promised heir. God made clear distinctions. Through Isaac would come the covenant line, the people of Israel. The Messiah through Ishmael would come a great nation, 12 princes, numerous descendants, Genesis 17:20-21. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac. Both sons were blessed. Both received promises of becoming great nations. But the covenant, the special relationship with God that would lead to Israel and ultimately to Jesus, would go through Isaac. This wasn't about God loving one and hating the other. It was about God's specific plan having a specific path, while still blessing both lines. The crisis, the expulsion, the feast, and the conflict. When Isaac was weaned, probably around 2 to 3 years old, Abraham held a great feast to celebrate. This was a significant milestone in ancient culture. At this celebration, Sarah saw something that triggered her deepest insecurities, Genesis 21:9. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. The Hebrew word translated mocking, tzahak, is actually related to Isaac's name, Yitzhak. Some translations say Ishmael was playing with or laughing with Isaac. Others suggest it was mocking or making fun of. The text is actually ambiguous. Was Ishmael, now a teenager, about 15 to 16 years old, genuinely mocking his little brother? Or was he just playing, and Sarah interpreted it as mockery because of her own insecurities? We don't know. But Sarah's reaction was extreme. Sarah's demand, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." This was harsh, brutal. After Ishmael had lived in Abraham's household for 15 to 16 years, after Hagar had served Sarah for decades, Sarah wanted them gone, out of the household, disinherited, expelled. Abraham's distress, Genesis 21:11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Abraham loved Ishmael. This wasn't easy for him. He was being asked to send away a teenage son he'd raised, along with the boy's mother. This was a crisis. Abraham was torn between his wife's demand and his love for his firstborn son. God's directive, God spoke to Abraham, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. God didn't say Sarah was right to demand this. He said to do it. The heartbreaking departure. Early the next morning, Abraham gave Hagar bread and a skin of water, put them on her shoulders, and sent her away with Ishmael. Think about this. Abraham, a wealthy patriarch with vast flocks and herds, sent away his son and the boy's mother with just bread and water. Why? Some scholars suggest Abraham wasn't cutting them off financially. He was following the legal protocol for formal separation, while knowing God would provide. Others suggest he was limited by Sarah's oversight and gave what he could discreetly. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water ran out, Hagar put her son under a bush. He was still her baby, even as a teenager, and walked away so she wouldn't watch him die. She wept. Ishmael wept. God heard again. Genesis 21:17-18. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." God heard, just as he'd heard Hagar the first time in the wilderness. That's why the boy was named Ishmael. God hears. God opened Hagar's eyes and she saw a well of water. They drank. They survived. And Genesis 21:20-21. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Ishmael thrived. God was with. He developed into a skilled archer, a desert survivor, a leader. He married an Egyptian woman, his mother's homeland, connecting both his father's Mesopotamian heritage and his mother's Egyptian roots. Now what happened to both lines, Ishmael's descendants? Genesis 25:12-18 records Ishmael's genealogy. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. God fulfilled his promise exactly. 12 princes. A great nation. Ishmael lived 137 years, a full blessed life. The text says, his descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt as you go toward Ashur, and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. This describes the Arabian Peninsula from the area near Egypt extending eastward and southward. The 12 tribes of Ishmael became the various Arab tribes of the region. Hostility here doesn't necessarily mean constant warfare. The Hebrew can mean living independently or settling in the face of their relatives, maintaining their fierce independence and nomadic lifestyle. Isaac's descendants. Through Isaac came Jacob, later renamed Israel, whose 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Through this line came the nation of Israel, the Davidic kingship, the prophets, the Messiah. Christians believe this is Jesus. The covenant promise, the special relationship with God, went through this line. Did they reconcile? Here is something beautiful that most people miss. Genesis 25:9. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. When Abraham died at 175 years old, both sons came together to bury their father. Isaac and Ishmael, who had been separated for decades, reunited to honor Abraham. They stood together at their father's grave. They collaborated in burial. They shared grief. The biblical text doesn't describe conflict or hatred between them. It describes two brothers doing what sons should do, honoring their father together. This is important. The biblical narrative doesn't present Isaac and Ishmael as enemies. It presents them as brothers who had different destinies, but shared a father and could still come together in important moments. The biblical relationships throughout the Old Testament. The descendants of Isaac, Israelites, had various relationships with different Arab tribes, sometimes hostile. Israel fought with Midianites, Amalekites, and other desert peoples, border conflicts and resource competition, sometimes cooperative. Trade relationships, diplomatic marriages, alliances against common enemies, often complicated. Edomites, descendants of Esau, Isaac's son, were considered brothers. Moabites and Ammonites, descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, had complex relationships. Various Arab tribes had different treaties and relationships. The biblical picture is nuanced. Not simple hatred, but complex relationships based on geography, resources, politics, and family history. The religious interpretations. Here's where the story gets complicated, because three major world religions claim Abraham as their spiritual father, but they interpret the Isaac and Ishmael story differently. Jewish interpretation. In Jewish tradition, Isaac is the child of promise through whom the covenant continues. Ishmael is blessed, but outside the covenant relationship, the Jewish people descend from Isaac through Jacob. Ishmael's descendants are blessed by God, but follow a separate path. The story emphasizes God's faithfulness to his specific promises through specific people. Jewish interpretation sees this as about election, God choosing a specific people, Israel, for a specific purpose, being a light to nations, preserving his truth, bringing the Messiah. Christian interpretation. Christian theology adds layers. Isaac represents salvation by promise and grace through faith, not works. Ishmael represents human effort to fulfill God's promise. Paul uses this analogy in Galatians 4:21-31, not about ethnic superiority, but about faith versus works. Christians see themselves as spiritual children of Abraham through faith, like Isaac was born through promise. The physical descent doesn't matter as much as spiritual descent through faith in Christ. Christian interpretation emphasizes that both Jews and Gentiles can become children of Abraham through faith, just as Isaac was born through faith in God's impossible promise. Islamic interpretation. Islam has a different narrative that diverges from the biblical account. Muslims honor both Isaac and Ishmael as prophets. Islamic tradition holds that Ishmael, not Isaac, was taken to be sacrificed, though the Quran doesn't name which son. Islam teaches that Ishmael and Hagar went to Mecca, where Ishmael helped Abraham build the Kaaba. Prophet Muhammad is believed to descend from Ishmael through his son. Keter. Islam sees Ishmael as fully equal in spiritual status to Isaac, not secondary. Islamic tradition celebrates Ishmael's line as producing the final prophet, Muhammad, and the final revelation, the Quran. The divergences. Where do these traditions agree? Abraham is the father of both sons. Both sons were blessed by God. Both sons produced great nations. Abraham is a model of faith. Where do they diverge? Which son was taken to be sacrificed? Genesis says Isaac. Islamic tradition suggests Ishmael, though Quran doesn't specify where Ishmael and Hagar went. Bible says desert of Paran. Islamic tradition says Mecca. The nature of the covenant, exclusive through Isaac, or equal for both. The spiritual significance of each line, setting aside the later religious interpretations. What does the biblical story itself teach? Lesson number 1. Human impatience vs. divine timing. Sarah and Abraham tried to fulfill God's promise through human effort, Hagar, rather than waiting for God's timing, Isaac. The result? Family conflict, pain, separation, and lasting complications. When we try to force God's promises through our own schemes, we create problems. God's promises come to pass in God's timing, not ours. Lesson number 2. Cultural norms don't equal God's best. The Hagar arrangement was culturally acceptable, but it wasn't God's plan. Just because something is normalized in your culture doesn't mean it aligns with God's purposes. We can't assume that everyone does it this way means it's the right way. Lesson number 3. God sees the overlooked. Hagar was an Egyptian slave caught in someone else's family drama. Twice she ended up alone in the wilderness. Twice God saw her, spoke to her, provided for her. God sees the marginalized, the overlooked, the powerless. Your status doesn't determine God's care. Lesson number 4. God's plans are bigger than our mistakes. Abraham and Sarah's impatience created complications, but God didn't abandon his plan. He blessed both sons. He provided for both lines. He turned human mistakes into his purposes. Your failures don't cancel God's promises. He can work with messy, complicated situations. Lesson number 5. Blessing isn't zero-sum. God blessing Isaac didn't mean he cursed Ishmael. God blessing Ishmael didn't diminish Isaac's blessing. God's favor for one person doesn't require his disfavor toward another. He can bless multiple people in different ways. Lesson number 6. Family dysfunction has lasting impact. The choices made in Abraham's tent echoed through generations. Family patterns, wounds, and conflicts don't just disappear, they ripple forward. How you handle your family relationships matters more than you think. Lesson number 7. Reconciliation is possible. Isaac and Ishmael buried their father together. Despite separation, despite different paths, they could still come together in important moments. Your past conflicts don't have to define your future. Reconciliation, even if not full restoration, is possible. Lesson number 8. God's covenant doesn't mean others aren't blessed. God's choice of Isaac for the covenant line didn't mean Ishmael was unloved or unblessed. Special calling doesn't equal exclusive blessing. If God has called you for something specific, it doesn't mean everyone else is rejected. Lesson number 9. Your beginning doesn't determine your ending. Ishmael's origin story was complicated, born from impatience, raised in family dysfunction, expelled as a teenager. But God was WI to him. He became great. He lived a full life. He reconciled with his brother. Your difficult beginning doesn't determine your ending. Lesson number 10. Interpretation shapes legacy. The same biblical story has been interpreted 3 different ways by 3 major religions. How we understand the story shapes how we relate to its implications. We must be careful about reading our own agendas into ancient texts. The biblical narrative is more complex than simple us versus them frameworks. The modern implications what this story doesn't do, it doesn't explain or justify modern Middle Eastern conflicts. Those have complex political, economic, and historical causes beyond this story. Establish ethnic superiority. Both sons were blessed. Mandate perpetual hostility. Isaac and Ishmael reconciled at Abraham's death. Provide a blueprint for territorial claims. Modern nation-states didn't exist in Abraham's time. Simplify thousands of years of history into a single narrative. What this story does do, does, show the common ancestry that Jews, Christians, and Muslims acknowledge, demonstrate God's care for all of Abraham's descendants, reveal how family choices ripple through history, teach about faith, patience, and God's faithfulness to promises, illustrate that God can work through complicated, messy, human situations. The danger of misusing this story. Throughout history, this story has been misused to justify hatred between groups, claim superiority based on descent, legitimize violence, oversimplify complex modern situations, ignore the human dignity of the other side. The biblical text itself doesn't support these uses. It presents a family story complicated, painful, but ultimately showing God's care for all involved. The common ground, what Jews, Christians, and Muslims can agree on. Abraham is a father figure to all 3 faiths. Faith in God matters more than ethnic descent. Both Isaac and Ishmael received blessings. Family stories are complicated, but meaningful. God's mercy extends to all Abraham's children. Moving forward, rather than using this ancient story to fuel modern conflicts, we can recognize shared heritage and common ancestry, acknowledge complexity rather than forcing simple narratives, honor the dignity of all people, regardless of descent, learn from the family reconciliation at Abraham's burial, focus on the biblical themes of God's provision, care for the marginalized, and ability to work through human imperfection. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is ultimately a family story. Two brothers with the same father, but different mothers. Both loved, both blessed, both with great destinies. The biblical narrative shows human impatience creating complications, God's faithfulness despite human mistakes, provision for a LL involved. Not just one, separation that served both destinies, reconciliation at the end. It's not a story of hatred. It's a story of a complicated family trying to navigate an impossible situation, elderly parents, infertility, cultural practices, divine promises, jealousy, love, and ultimately, two paths that both led to blessing. 4,000 years later, the echoes of that family story continue. Three major world religions claim Abraham. Billions of people trace their spiritual heritage to choices made in ancient tents in the desert of Canaan. But the biblical text itself reminds us, God heard Hagar's cry. God provided water in the wilderness. God was with Ishmael as he grew. God blessed both sons, and both sons stood together at their father's grave. That's the story the Bible actually tells, not inevitable hatred, but complicated family relationships where God's mercy extended to all Abraham's children, each in their own way. Maybe that's the lesson we need most today, the capacity to see the full humanity of those we consider other, to recognize shared heritage rather than just differences, and to trust that God's blessing for one group doesn't require his curse on another. Two sons, one father, different paths, both blessed. What surprised you most about this biblical story? Did you know both sons were blessed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more biblical history that reveals the full narrative, not just simplified versions.